What is going on, guys? My name is Landon. Today I am bringing you guys yet in another video, and for today's video we're talking about the roster organization, the team known as FaZe. Now, everyone knows about FaZe. It seems to be the hot topic right now over on Reddit. I'll put a link down in the description, obviously, if you guys are curious, to our COD competitive Reddit. A lot of good stuff there, a lot of great people over, obviously on that website. So if you guys want to check that out, feel free to do so. But the main topic on Reddit, obviously, has been talking about FaZe. If you've been able to watch the competitive scene, if you've been watching a lot of LAN tournaments, even the Call of Duty World League, you know that FaZe just hasn't really been up to point when it comes down to their LAN situations. Everyone knows, coming from Advanced Warfare, this was seen as a top team, if not maybe even a top 2 team, as the game kind of was toward the end of it, I guess you could say, as far as the organization just went. And honestly, the team that they have right now, obviously consisting of Clayster, Attach, Zuma, and Enable, looks and probably is, I think without a doubt, the best team that FaZe has ever had. And so with that, a lot of people think that the reason why this team is kind of struggling is the fact that they don't really want to make a roster change. So today, what we're going to be talking about in this video, I've done a lot of, in some ways, research on this FaZe roster, even coming from Advanced Warfare. I actually watched like a good amount of hour, or 2 hours, I guess you could say, of just overall game footage from their game plans back in Advanced Warfare and now into Black Ops 3, do their Call of Duty World League matches, do their LAN performances, who they've lost to, the issues that they've been suffering throughout their games, so on and so forth. So today, we're going to be talking about and answering the question, should FaZe make a roster change? I just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer as well. I do apologize if this is a very long video. I could be going on for as long as, I don't even know. But I just want to apologize just ahead of time if it is long. You know, you guys ask for stuff like this, so there you go. So I think there are 2 questions that I've heard teams talk about, and that teams should really take in consideration when they decide or really want to make a roster change, as long as the team likes each other. Now, if there's already issues within the roster, they already want to get rid of someone, they're probably not asking these questions. But I think a solid team like FaZe, guys who like each other, guys who have been teaming for a very long time, ever since UMG Dallas back in Advanced Warfare, this group does not want to make a roster change. But I think 2 questions that you are asking if you are in FaZe's situation, if you are looking to potentially make one, or at least in the discussion of doing so, is how do we not make a change? How do we not make a roster change, whether it's regarding, roles, which of course we know throughout all of Black Ops 3 up to this point, even I think, honestly, through midway of Stage 1, they were still making role changes. You know, Clayster started off this game just as, I think every team coming from Advanced Warfare did their best to at least try to stay the exact same way coming into Black Ops 3. Clayster was the main AR player. Zuma and Attach were the main subs, and Able kind of also play a little bit of sub, but also could run a little bit of an AR at times, that also kind of, in some ways, play that objective role along with Attach. Of course, that in some ways didn't really change too much, but the AR players, Zuma running an AR, Enable running an AR, Clayster running more of a sub role back with Attach, and of course, that kind of worked out for them online, but the main issue for them has been their LAN placings. Of course, we'll get to that, but I kind of want to talk about it. The next question that you ask when it comes down to this roster, or when you're regarding making a roster change, at least in my opinion, would be, what are the issues with our losses? How are we losing games? Along with the question of, how do we not make a change, is also the question of how in some ways do we improve what we're messing up on? What are the issues? How are we losing games? Is it the fact of, our search game? Is it our hardpoint game? Is it our uplink and CTF? What really kind of is the stemming of all our issues regardless of our losses, and how do we not make a change? Is what are we struggling with? How do we improve on that? And how do we, in some ways, as a roster together, decide on the situations to work on this as a team? And this team has obviously done that. You've been able to see, if you've watched, FaZe's team scrims, and I think, Clayster streams on MLG. I've definitely seen Zuma and Attach stream on their Twitch streams as well. If you guys obviously want to check those out, feel free to do so. But at times, you'll definitely see these guys talk. These guys are really good friends with one another. And I think, in some ways, that definitely works out in their favor, and also kind of hinders what could be a, really good, in some ways, team relationship. Because if you get too close with your teammates, in some ways you're afraid to tell them when they're doing something wrong. That's just a fact of life. And sometimes maybe even you're more honest with them. You might be saying, you really should have made that play because you feel more comfortable with them. That's just the issue with certain personalities working out in teams, and I'm not saying that's the issue with FaZe. That could definitely benefit you when it comes down to chemistry, which we've seen a number of rosters benefit from, whether it's Optic Gaming and NA, or whether it's Infused from EU. There's a lot of rosters that definitely thrive, and I think if you are good friends outside of the game, it definitely benefits you a lot more of the time. And I want to go back to talking about, more of their role situation that they've had, because that's definitely been, I think, a major kind of cliff for them that they haven't really been able to get over as far as it stands right now, as far as Black Ops 3 is concerned. Because, like I said, I talked about the roles early in the game, who was running what. I was able to cast them very, very early on when it came down to game battles, maybe like even week 1 or week 2 of the game coming out. I was actually able to I can't remember I think I was watching Zuma's stream, and they were getting ready to go offline. I think Zuma was, and he was kind of in a team scrum. I think they ended up losing a game. They were in the theater, and Enable and Zuma didn't really argue with one another, but Enable was telling him that he was doing something wrong, and Zuma, was kind of going back and forth. He's like, I really want to run an AR, and Glacier was actually telling him you really need to, kind of just explaining that Zuma really doesn't, I don't think he really likes his role of playing an AR. People were starting to regard Zuma as one of the best young prospects that we've seen throughout Advanced Warfare, and definitely one of the top players throughout all of Advanced Warfare. I mean, he made his shirt based on an S&D strategy where he would constantly be on the flank regarding people in his search and destroy game, being the Zuma flank, which everyone knows about. It's still obviously a major topic that we talk about today when it comes down to games. But he was so good when it came down to search and destroy because they would let him do exactly what he wants to. And now coming into Black Ops 3, and I think it's kind of interesting to see how this roster kind of forms, because I was going to talk about this later, but I'm going to talk about it now because it kind of in some ways translates. There's a thing when it comes down to experienced rosters that you have to take in consideration when it comes down to roster changes that I've personally noticed over, watching teams for a long time, is that the reason why you always go with a veteran, at least in my opinion, if both players are evenly skilled, the reason why you always go with a veteran is the fact of having previous experience on different titles. Now, one issue that I do see with this FaZe team that I think could be the stem of a lot of their issues is the fact you gotta take this in consideration, right? Glacier is the only player for this team who has played in a Black Ops title competitively. Zoom and Attach were known for being players in Ghost. That was the main thing for them. Those guys were main players, especially for teams like Denial. We obviously saw them kind of rise to the ranks as well through different teams, even Attach over on Rise for a little bit of time. I want to say it was around the time of Season 2 is when we first saw Glacier, because I believe the organization known as Erupt was bought out by Denial East or West. I can't remember the exact, it was Denial East or West, and the roster was Perplexed, Legal, it was Perplexed, Vexed, Legal, and Zuma. We're actually on this Erupt roster. They ended up getting bought out by Denial. Then that's when they ended up getting actually into Season 2 of the MLG Pro League back in Ghost, which I believe, was one of the first seasons that we've ever had. Of course, different things like that happened. And, I think they did fairly well. I know they got one of the lower placings in the overall season, but that was the first time where we saw Zuma kind of make a mark. So around Season 2, Enable was really known, obviously being on that cursed roster, kind of, in some ways, progressively kind of rising through the ranks is where, Enable was more known as, I guess you could say. So with that in mind, these guys haven't really played, like I said, a Black Ops title competitively because they more came from Ghost and Advanced Warfare. And of course, everyone knows, of Glacier. Glacier is obviously a stapled veteran when it comes down to the Call of Duty scene. Everyone knows and remembers him back from Black Ops 2, playing on Unite, playing on, Complexity, of course, as well. And even before that, playing on Roughnecks, playing on Obey for a short time, playing with, what was it? I can't remember the roster, back in MW2, Art of Execution. He's playing with those guys. Like, everyone knows of Clayster when it comes down to this competitive scene. I think he was the most overall achieved as far as current money that he earned. I think he was the most achieved player when it came down to just money that he earned throughout the MW2 season. So this guy's been around for a long time. Everyone knows that, but he's playing with 3 players alongside of him that are newer to the competitive scene in some ways because they've never played a Black Ops title competitively before. So the reason why I brought that up in the first place is why I always choose a veteran, and I'm not really calling these guys that they're saying that they're not veterans. The reason why I'm choosing a veteran over these guys is the fact that they've played most likely a Black Ops title before, and they know how they can translate from title to title. When you've played an Infinity Ward game, when you've played, a Treyarch game, when you've played a certain game from a certain, company, there are certain players that thrive during those, there are certain players that dive during those, there are certain players that you're going to see start to take a little bit of a notice, and that's always a problem for players to get used to because their role can constantly switch up. One player that I always look at as kind of, in some ways, a gauge is a player like Merc, right? Because Merc, back in Black Ops 2, was obviously an anchor, coming into obviously titles as they kind of progress on. Heading into Advanced Warfare, he was an objective player. He was a support player, for God's sake. Like, how do you translate from that situation to another? And there's been some players who have translated from that very, very well. Slasher is a great example of one player who's been able to kind of change his role constantly. Parasite as well. There's been some really talented guys who can translate that role over a short period of time, and even new players like Facento, who have changed from a hardcore AR player to now a objective type of player for obviously Elevate. There's some guys who can do it. There's some guys who are just so used to the game in general where they cannot switch up their role because they're used to Call of Duty being on the ground. They're used to that boots on the ground combat that everyone knows and obviously everyone loves. To be a Call of Duty pro, you have to be very, very versatile, and that's the exact reason why I always choose a veteran over a player who's newer whenever they are at the same skill level. And I'm not saying that these guys are at the same skill level with other pros. I'm not saying that whatsoever. I'm not saying that I wouldn't take these guys, obviously, because I think they're very, very talented players. Obviously, everyone knows that. I'm not taking anything away from them. I'm just saying that might be a reason why they are struggling because they're not used to that type of switch because they've only played competitively for 2 titles, this one being their 3rd, and not really being used to a Black Ops title, playing it on a constant competitive level against the best players in the world. So with that long spiel out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and talk about their run in Advanced Warfare, because of course this team ended up forming right after the Season 2 playoffs of the Advanced Warfare MLG Pro League season. Season 2 playoffs being over at X Games. The previous team was consisting of Enable, Zuma, Slasher, and Hook. Slasher and Hook ended up going over to Denial, in which case that was Clayster and Attach's role to kind of leave that Denial championship team, who actually ended up winning COD Champs. Those 2 players leave, which was a huge deal because that team was in some ways kind of going down. That was their only win at a LAN, obviously the biggest stage of them all, but they weren't really progressing. They weren't really making much strides after that, and it was a major surprise because that was Clayster's first team after leaving Optic Gaming. He'd been on that team for such a long time, and in a lot of people's opinions, that was a major shock to see him leave that roster. So for him to come over to FaZe, it was like, what would this team really produce? A lot of people were saying, this is going to be a really talented roster. How would they perform? And adding and gaining, I guess you say, attaching Clayster from Denial was a huge boost to them, because after this, they would go on an absolute tear, winning their first LAN together over at UMG Dallas, in which case they would end up beating Optic Gaming 3-0 at that LAN. Not much longer, Gfinity, the Summer Championship, would start to come up, and they would end up finishing first in that LAN as well. Back-to-back tournaments, they end up getting first, and also they beat Optic Gaming in that tournament as well, beating them 4-3 in a best-of-7. So back-to-back tournaments, they end up winning. They look to be on a hot streak, and then they end up going to UMG DC, which I was actually at that event, also at Dallas. And they end up finishing 7th, 8th in that tournament. They started off pretty well in their pools. I believe there was 3 teams tied with them as far as the overall 3-1 map count, and I believe they ended up getting sent to losers because Justice had that absolute insane run, that roster of what? It was Spacely, Kenny, Envoy, and Assault. So they were sent to losers. They ended up playing against Justice again, I believe. They ended up losing to them. Then they ended up going up against ISO, and they ended up losing that one in I think game 5 or something like that. So FaZe is knocked down after a great tournament run, winning 2 LANs in a row, which is absolutely unheard of because of the run that Optic Gaming was having at the time. So Optic in some ways gets revenge for winning UMG DC after the loss against FaZe against Dallas, but they don't exactly meet up with one another. So obviously, there wasn't really a LAN for a long time. Of course, the MLG regular season for Season 3 started to kind of boost up, and in the end, it would be actually FaZe who ends up finishing 3rd in the online season, right behind Optic Gaming and also right behind Elevate. I believe Optic ended up finishing, I think they went 11-0 or something like that. Something correct. I think they went undefeated, despite of whatever their record was. I know they went undefeated in that overall season. But then MLG Pro League season playoffs start to come about. So that's really where it kind of matters. And honestly, as much as online means, and of course it means even more in Black Ops 3, when it comes into the playoffs, that's where I really decide who was the actual victor of that season. Who was the real team who was constantly grinding out? Who was the real team who was constantly, in some ways, preparing for a certain LAN to be coming up? And that's whenever we saw probably one of the craziest moments in all of Advanced Warfare, where it was FaZe coming down from the losers bracket, and they ended up beating Optic Gaming, like I said, coming from losers, having to win 2 best of 7s, not best of 5s, best of 7s against the best team in the world, in which they won the first best of 7 4-1. They come back, win the second best of 7 as well, winning that one 4-1 as well. You're thinking, Optic Gaming, what is going on with these guys? Because, granted, they won UMG DC, granted, they won the regular season, but they've never beaten FaZe, and that actual thing, that phenomenon would never end, because when it came to MLG World Finals, they ended up placing 5th or 6th, and Optic Gaming would win that one. But every FaZe fan, every Optic Gaming fan who were constantly going at one another toward the end of Advanced Warfare realized and said, granted, Optic Gaming was the best team throughout Advanced Warfare. Everyone can agree with that. The amount of championships that they won, the amount of series that they were dominant in, and the overall, I guess you say, just presence to what they brought was of course noted, but Optic Gaming never beat this team when it came down to a LAN. So holding on to that, FaZe makes their way, of course, heading into Black Ops 3, where we of course have the first showcase. I don't really call it a tournament. I don't really call it, in some ways, an official LAN. I don't really think that I mean, I guess you could say the 2 teams who were in the grand finals were both Rise and Optic Gaming, and of course those are the top 2 teams right now in the game. So it definitely showed at least some signs of what would be later to come. But we ended up seeing FaZe end up losing to TK in 1 game, best of 3, and they ended up finishing 5th through 8th. So, I really, you can kind of consider that to be a loss, but technically it wasn't really. There were a lot of accurate things that kind of came from that LAN, but no one really respected it as a LAN, so we don't really have to count that one, but we could definitely kind of throw it up on the board as they end up losing to TK, which they really shouldn't have. Everyone knows LANs are scarce as far as Black Ops 3 goes, so there obviously aren't as many LANs to talk about, especially since we're already halfway through this game, and I think I talked about, what, like 6 or 7 LANs that happened for FaZe in that, like, what, short spree of Advanced Warfare. We haven't even had that as far as half the game goes, but we'll talk about that. We won't talk about that. Of course, next LAN coming up, they had UMG South Carolina, and they ended up losing to Team Liquid. Obviously, a very, very top team, coming from what was really a challenger team. That roster of Burnsoff, Merc, Study, and also Apathy. Those guys were on a tear beating, obviously, this FaZe roster, winning that one 4-3, and that would obviously knock out FaZe in that tournament, giving them a 5th through 8th placing. So Totino's 5th through 8th, University of South Carolina 5th through 8th, Call of Duty World League Stage 1 would obviously be coming up, and they ended up finishing 3rd overall in the regular season, having a 15-7 record. Hardpoint game, they ended up finishing 12-10. Search and Destroy, 17-11. Uplink, 14-8. And CTF, 9-6. And their main slayer, their main player for that season being Attach, who ended up having a top 5 player in KD ratio, and I think overall just a top 5 player in the game throughout stage 1. Definitely a dominant slayer for this team. Can be inconsistent at some points, but if you need a player to go off on the hard point, if you need a player to go off on the uplink, Attach was definitely the man to do it, and easily the best player for FaZe throughout that first season. So after stage 1, of course, the stage 1 playoffs start to come up, in which case they end up finishing 3rd through 4th, and you're thinking, oh, that's a pretty good placing for this team, but they only beat one team to get to that spot, which I'm not taking anything away from them, because of course that was the entire tournament format. It's one best of 7 single elimination, which I'm of course not a fan of, because I don't really think it leads to the most accurate of overall placings and overall, I guess say, like team comp and how teams actually perform, but they end up beating Complexity 4-0, and honestly, they really shouldn't have won that series, not taking it away from FaZe, and maybe they should have, but in a 4-0 fashion, beating Complexity, because you think in that matchup, because I was, of course, I'm not really going to say this, but I was involved with that series in some way, and I remember seeing and watching that series very, very closely and seeing that the hardpoint Complexity was up in that series, that they were looking to take the hardpoint versus FaZe, which is really surprising. Of course, Complexity was a great hardpoint team in stage 1. That was obviously the roster having Parasite on the team rather than Goodjar, for those who might be a little bit confused. So before that change ended up going down, they were a great search and destroy team, but their hardpoint wasn't that bad either. So they ended up leading FaZe. FaZe ends up making the comeback. I believe it was, I want to say, Hunted, Search, and Destroy, and there was a play where I believe Complexity was up 5-1. Ricky has the opportunity to defuse the bomb. It might have not been 5, maybe 4-1. It might have been that. I can't remember exactly what the situation was. Ricky literally just has to defuse the bomb, in which case he ends up messing up trying to defuse it, and there's no more time for him left to do that. And FaZe, off of that round, them winning that round, they end up making the comeback, going up 2-0 in a best of 7, and end up obviously kind of climbing through. So, not taking away from FaZe's victory, but there were a lot of opportunities where Complexity really should have won those first 2 games, and honestly, maybe if a couple plays would have gone their way, they could have potentially gone up 2-0, and maybe there could have been another awkward placing for this FaZe roster. But of course, one series win automatically gives them that placing of 3rd through 4th, but you know, you can kind of count that as a 3rd through 4th placing. Of course it is, but one series decided them to get a higher placing than what were their previous ones. And of course, in a recent tournament, ESWC would end up losing to Splice in a 3-0 fashion. Their placing so far in Black Ops 3, and of course, I want you to take this with a grain of salt, because of the lack of lands that we've had, the lack of accurate lands that we've had, whether you count University of South Carolina, whether you count Totino's, and honestly, if you really want to count ESWC, which I think you should, you think about their placings, 5th through 8th, in some ways, 3rd in the regular season. I think you should count that. Stage 1 playoffs, they ended up finishing 3rd through 4th, but it was only one series that took them to get to that spot, and also ESWC, where they finished 7th through 8th. So a lot of those 8th spot placings, that 5th through 7th, 5th through 8th, 7th through 8th type of placings they've had, have been a reoccurring issue for this team. And of course, they ended up losing to Splice, and honestly, that last tournament, of course, if anyone would like to watch that video, it was one of my previous ones, you guys can obviously feel free to watch that recap. If you guys didn't really watch ESWC, or, you know, really a part of that, didn't really know what happened, why were the EU teams doing so well, if you guys are curious, make sure to check that out. And I think, honestly, it might take a little bit of that sting away from FaZe, because it would be Splice who ended up taking out Rise Nation in the game after this. Of course, once Splice beat FaZe, they end up being eliminated from the tournament. They face off against Rise. They also beat them too. So, in some ways, I don't think you can really take this loss for FaZe. I think in some ways, it's like you look at it and you're like, oh, we lost to Splice. You know, we should have really won that game. But they also beat technically the number 2 team in the game, right behind Optic Gaming, which is Rise Nation, which I think everyone can kind of agree with that. So, yeah, it's a major loss for them, but where does Splice rank? It was just like a really good day for them. You know, do you really take that loss in some ways into a high consideration, because they did technically lose to the second best team at this tournament? That's up to you, of course. And of course, what we're in the midst of right now being, you know, obviously in stage 2, where FaZe currently, and of course this will be very, very outdated. Of course, I'm sure when most people watch this, you know, it will be outdated. But as it stands for right now, FaZe are leading the Call of Duty World League with a 3-1 record. Can't really take anything away from that. I mean, Optic Gaming right now is 2-2. H2K are 3-1. DT are 3-1 as well. I'm not taking away from those rosters, but as far as last season would go, you definitely say that's a little bit of an awkward spot, especially for most of these teams, especially being Optic Gaming, even being Envy, where in some ways the top 2 out of the 3 teams in the game right now aren't exactly where they should be. Let's go and talk about this team as it stands for right now, maybe even some of the issues. Of course, we've kind of talked about their history, the reason why potentially they haven't made a roster change. from Advanced Warfare, realize that this is the best team that they've ever had. But right now, from what I've been able to see as far as the Stage 2 regular season has gone, maybe even a couple notes even from Stage 1 that kind of in some ways have carried over, has been their hardpoint slayers. Their hardpoint slayers right now, and it seems to be in most games, it is going to be Enable and Attach who are going off for the most part, which are their sub players. And a lot of people who've been critiquing this team saying that they are a very fast team. Their sub players have got to calm down. They've got to get more of a sub player who can in some ways maybe even substitute a role. Maybe give Enable back that AR player, that AR presence, that AR weapon that he had in the beginning of the game, which obviously saw a lot of success for them. Because he was one of the few players who was being a hardcore, not really hardcore, but an objective player who had an AR in the hill for most of the games. And that was kind of a surprising factor for a lot of people. The fact of Zuma running an SMG along with Attach, and then Glacier running an AR. There are a lot of switches with this team even still, where you'll see Enable run an AR, and then Glacier has to sub on some maps. It's very hard to keep up with this team, and for someone like me who has a registered document of every single thing that players do as far as their specialists, what ARs, what weapons they decide to do, what bans and protects they do on certain maps, it is very hard to compete and to kind of in some ways keep up with this FaZe team because they are constantly changing what is going on with their team right now. So, but through all of that, their top slayers in a hardpoint have always been Enable and Attach. As far as their Search and Destroy game goes, I guess it really respawns. It normally is Enable and Attach, but through Search and Destroy as well, it is going to be Attach and Zuma, who are constantly going to be dropping big numbers. You notice the one player who I mentioned through both of these has been Attach, who is their main slayer for the most part. He is the glue that kind of brings this team together, and if he's not going off, this team sees a lot of hard times. Since the 1.06 patch, we obviously saw the Scythe be mentioned. Of course, there was a little bit of tampering with other specialists as far as other weapon specialists, being the Tempest, even being at times the Sparrow for a short time, maybe even the Annihilator. But for the most part, the Tempest is right now the main. I used to say for most teams, I'd say maybe even 50-50 right now between the Tempest and the Scythe. Right now, as far as regular hard points go, Glacier's going to be the player with the Tempest, and the other three guys are going to be using the other three main abilities that everyone knows: Active Camo, Heat Wave, and Kinetic Armor. However, on Uplink, they will give Zuma the Scythe at times, give Glacier the Tempest, and have the other two rock with whatever specialists make it through. But the issue with me, and I think the one player that I'm definitely looking at from this team right now has got to be Zuma. And the reasoning why I bring up Zuma, because I feel like his role on this team is not really solidified for the most part. Because if you look at it right now, essentially, it's really hard to kind of keep up. For the most part, you'd like to assume that on most maps, and I'm being very specific with this, on most maps, Zuma is going to be the secondary AR and the third sub. Glacier being the main AR for most maps, because sometimes he likes to pull out the sub, sometimes they give Enable the AR. But for most maps, like I said, Glacier is going to be the main AR, and then there's Zuma right behind him. I don't think that Zuma is in a really good spot with his overall role, because you do look at, as far as like a certain player, it's always kind of hard when you have those two middle of the pack players being that second sub, being that secondary AR, being those two hybrid players, because and a lot of the times, you don't really know what they're supposed to do, because at random times throughout certain games, and of course when it comes down to hardpoint, the fun issue that I think with a lot of people and a lot of people who kind of keep up with stats is that you're not going to see the same person be in the hill at all times for most maps. When you watch FaZe, Glacier could be in the hill for a majority of the time. Attach Enabler could be in the hill for a majority of the time. And even times you'll see Zuma in the hill for a majority of the time. Even with teams like Optic Gaming, even with teams like Rise. Rise a lot of the time have a minute for every single player. Optic Gaming could have Scump and Karma in the hill. They could even have at times Formal being in the hill if Scump's slaying out. There are a number of different opportunities where you'll see this team have players in the hill, but I think the main issue with this roster as far as FaZe goes, kind of coming back to this team, is that Zuma doesn't have the role that he really wants to right now. I think Zuma wants to run that sub. I think he wants to be the exact same sub slayer, and just kind of in some ways to be a freed player, because there's some players who work better that way. For Envious right now, even for Team Liquid, if you let Apathy just go off and do his thing, of course being in some ways brought back to the roster, when I say let loose for the most part, I mean let him play his game, but also of course add him into the strategy. Like of course he's doing something for a certain reason. Of course he's focusing on the objective, but there are some players where you just have to let them loose. You have to let them play their own game, and they will find their way. It sounds kind of weird, but once you let them do that certain role, they fit themselves into the team automatically. That's like I said, this is a perfect example of Apathy. Apathy is one of the most aggressive sub players that we have right now in Black Ops 3. He has a role, and of course it's a sub slayer. He can also get in the hill all the time, but he's running around that map constantly. He is the guy what you think could have overdrive for most of the map. Like it wouldn't surprise me if Black Ops 3 has ended, we all realize that Apathy secretly has had overdrive for most of the game because of how fast he is running at players, and his overall gun skill is honestly unmatched in most gunfights because the guy's going off a lot of the time, and also scrapping up a lot of time. He has probably some of the most engagements out of every single person in the Call of Duty World League. Even players like Nagafen and Royalty back in Advanced Warfare, those guys would just like throw themselves at players, and it would win them the games. It didn't matter if they were going negative or positive or whatever. They could be going negative 10 every game, but they would still win it because they're always causing pressure on the opposition. I think that's the player that Zuma is in Advanced Warfare and still wants to be in Black Ops 3. And I mentioned earlier, of course, talking about the Zuma flank, of course, being that main player. I think he loved being in a situation where he was in some ways not someone who was always lacked upon, or he was always someone that was kind of looked upon to have to go off, but he enjoys being in that situation. He enjoys having the pressure on his shoulders, and to me, I think Zuma is one of the best players that we've had in a long time play Call of Duty, for being as young as he is and being in some ways as quickly noticed as he has been. I think once they find that correct role for Zuma, which I don't think the roles are solidified yet. I really don't think they are. I think in some ways I wouldn't mind seeing Enable in some ways kind of step out of that objective role, maybe even become the secondary AR, and we see Zuma step more as a sub player with attaching. And then again, of course, they've had that happen a couple times. These roles for this team, and I cannot express to you how many times we've seen this, these roles for these players have switched a numerous amount of times. But I want to talk about, and I think, and I'll kind of come to an end on this, that when it comes down to this team, I think the one player that you really need to be looking out for is going to be Zuma. Whether he's involved with roster changes or not, I have no idea if he will be, of course, because I haven't heard anything. I'm just making this video just on what I think. But I think once Zuma finds his role, and like I said, we've seen this with a number of different players who just really don't know what to do around the map. Replays from Luminosity was a major issue for him throughout most of the team, even for Spacely as well, because John was the main player for this team. You kind of compare John to Attach, because John was dropping the most numbers, he was dropping the most time in the hard point. Well, what do you do? Like, this guy is just doing everything for the map. Do I just hold lanes? Like, what am I supposed to do in this situation? My role every map is in some ways being changed up because we have to rely on this one guy to do everything for us. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Of course, Luminosity had some issues here and there, but they weren't a bad team. Of course, John, you would end up leaving Luminosity over to actually join up with Envious and obviously acquire Apathy along the way. But I think right now Zuma needs to be that main player with Attach. I think they give him the scythe when it comes down to respawn. I think they give him, in some ways, maybe even a weapon. Let him do his game. Let him play his role, and maybe even take his, in some ways, his opinions coming into games a lot more often. I had heard one time, not sure if this had any actual like relevance to it or not, but there was one time where I was listening to a team scrims, and Zuma had came into a call, and he was talking, I think maybe it might have been to Scump or something like that, and he said, yeah, Clayster's actually letting me call for some of the search and destroys now. And just to hear him say that was like, wow, that's actually kind of interesting. They're actually but like they're actually in some ways having the whole roster, and especially Zuma, even make some calls at certain points, because granted, Clayster's not the biggest player when it comes down to search and destroy. He's not dropping the most numbers for this team. It's over him to rely on certain players to do certain things as far as calling strategies, doing certain things is a big play. So I think that was a really good step in forward for this team, but ever since then we've seen some arguments go down with this team. I know there's been a lot of stuff that hasn't really been mentioned on stream, but for this team right now, I think these guys are definitely a roster that can improve. I think these are a group of guys who are incredibly talented and have that ability to be a top 4 and a top 5 team at a consistent basis, and if not, even at the current situation that they're in, being one of those teams can even rise higher to even compete with the likes of Vivius, to compete with teams like Rise Nation and even Opti Gaming at a current time. There is one thing that I want to point out, and something that I want to talk about is going to be their team house. That has been rumored. I've not heard exactly what is going to happen. Of course, I'm sure you guys know probably a lot more than I do on the team house situation. There's been rumors of when that's going to happen. When would these all occur, and how long do they have until the roster lock does occur? From what I've heard, week 6 is going to be the roster lock for NA. So essentially, I believe that is as long as they have until they can obviously make a change, of course, and have that actually be going through. So with that in mind, team house is looming. Do they decide to kind of wait, keep this roster together, waiting for that team house to come, or do they make a change right before the team house starts to happen so they can have that group of guys together yet again? And maybe, and not saying this is the reason why, of course I have no idea, but maybe the reason why they've been in some ways waiting on that team house is because they have an opportunity to potentially make a roster change. I have no idea. That's just something to kind of keep in mind. There's been some people kind of posting on Reddit certain possible pickups for this team. You pick up a player like Saints, who is an aggressive submachine gun player that you want on a roster, an aggressive Slayer. Do you sub him in for Zuma? A player like a player like Aches, do you sub him in for Zuma? Do you sub out Clayster? Do you put in some way Zuma and Enable's roles switch together? Do you put Attach as the main AR? I've seen a number of different ideas that people have had, and now that we finally come to the conclusion of this video, Landon, do you think, straight out, yes or no, do you think FaZe should make a roster change, yes or no? My answer would be no. I don't think we should see FaZe make a roster change yet. I think we wait because they are a very, very good online team. No one will doubt that they are a fantastic online team. When it comes down to their lane performances, they've just not been there. And I think that honestly, that team house presence together will definitely improve that. We've seen that improve with teams like Optic Gaming, of course. We've seen that improve with H2K for a time, and also for a short time CLG. They were performing very well on a team house. Not just connection, but also having that bond together, being in a LAN setting, being together. I think only will help this team out in the long run. So with that in mind, guys, let me know in the comments what you guys think about this overall video. I did a lot of research on this, so it would really help me out if you guys would leave a like and also subscribe for future videos like this. If you guys have any comments, any ideas behind this roster that you think maybe would lead to them making a roster change, you guys even think that they should make a roster change, yes or no, put it down in the comments and your reasoning why. If you guys, like I said, enjoyed this video, feel free to share it to anyone. I would really appreciate it. I'm very passionate about the Call of Duty scene, and I of course love kind of keeping up with this stuff. So I apologize the video was long. I really do appreciate if you made it to this point. You guys are absolutely insane if you have. And yeah, that's gonna do it for this video, guys. Should FaZe make a roster change? In my opinion, no. What is your opinion? Put it down in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching this video yet again. I'll see you all in the next one. Have a fantastic day, and until next time, peace out.